Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 12 of the Teeth Time podcast. Super excited to be recording it again pretty quickly. Pretty quick turnaround for me after recording my last episode with Raina on the Cusp. Check that one out if you haven't already. But I wanted to give you a quick little update on things that are going on in my life in dental school because I haven't really talked to my podcast listeners specifically about my life and what's happening before we get into the special guest that will be joining me on this episode. So this morning I had a lab practical in our fixed prosthodontics lab, and I had to cut a crown prep and then make a temporary crown, and I did okay on it. It wasn't my best work, but I got through it. And in general, things are going pretty well. I will say the major difference, and I can expand on this in the future, but the major difference that I've noticed between my D1 year and now my D2 year is really just the addition of a lot of lab work. So we really ramped up how much time we spend in the lab, and the work itself has gotten a bit harder and a bit more complex. I would say the school side of things is pretty similar to what we had in our first year, so that's good, but like I said, lab being more significant and more time consuming has made things a bit difficult. But life is good, and I'm loving the creation that is happening right now from my end, both on YouTube and on the podcast. So now I want to talk about who is joining me on this special episode of the podcast today. In this episode of Teeth Time, I'm speaking with Colin Carr, founder and CEO of CARR, a nationwide commercial real estate company that exclusively represents the unique needs and interests of healthcare providers. CARR is the nation's leading healthcare real estate advisor with a team of almost 150 experts that span coast to coast. Colin is here today to speak with me about how important commercial real estate is to doctors and dentists, and how this aspect of business can make or break our careers. This episode will benefit doctors who are considering their own practices and career moves, as well as students who are looking to educate themselves on their futures in the profession. Let's get into some real estate talk. It's Teeth Time. Colin Carr, welcome to the Teeth Time podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, super excited. You are the first individual that's come on the podcast who is not necessarily a dental student or a dentist. This podcast is relatively new. It's sort of a side venture that I've been enjoying here for a little bit, but I was really happy for the opportunity to expand the guests that have come onto the show. And I think today we'll be able to get into something that's a little bit beyond dental school and actually talk about the practice of dentistry, the business of dentistry. So I'm super excited to get into all of it. I guess we could just start out very simply with an introduction of you, who you are, and what you do.
Absolutely. So my name is Colin Carr. I have been involved in commercial real estate for over 2 decades. I started when I was 19, got out of high school, and did not know what I wanted to do. Met a gentleman that owned a lot of real estate, and started just shadowing him, and he mentored me for a couple of years. Moved to Colorado in my early 20s, got into brokerage. I started doing work for companies like Walmart, Wendy's, Blockbuster, large national retailers. And over the course of my career as it progressed, had the chance to work for a handful of healthcare providers, and saw firsthand how much they needed representation. I had a handful of transactions where I was the landlord's agent. I had physicians and dentists showing up trying to lease space. And I had a few of them that pulled me aside and just said, can you please help us? Like, we have no idea what we're doing. We've never done this before. We're really confused. And I just had that epiphany that healthcare providers need representation. They don't know where to go to get it. And so started working on that model, launched the company in 2009. And we are today in about 40 states, and we represent several thousand healthcare providers across the country with anything regarding real estate: lease renewals, purchases, acquisitions, expansions, anything with real estate for doctors or for dentists, we help them with, and that's the model.
Okay, so it sounds like you sort of got to experience a bunch of different facets of business, and then you sort of circled in on healthcare. Is that just because, and you may have kind of touched on this, but is that just because healthcare providers were sort of in a way inept when it came to real estate, or they just maybe didn't have as much business sense, and that's kind of why you saw an opportunity to help healthcare providers?
Yeah, I mean, healthcare providers are incredibly intelligent, but they're not trained on the practice management side, specifically in real estate. I mean, you're trained clinically. That's what you guys do. You go to undergrad, you go to dental school, you go to residency program potentially, and you hear about practice management. You maybe hear from a lender every once in a while or consultant, which is great. But real estate for most dentists is the second highest expense behind payroll over a 25, 30-year career. And very seldomly is it actually talked about. So for me, I had done multifamily, I had done retail, office, industrial. I enjoyed all those types of transactions. But when I started working for healthcare providers, I personally believe that was the area that I could have the most impact and influence, and I could help achieve the greatest results. And so started doing a bunch of dental and medical deals. The doctors were incredibly thankful, and it was the obvious choice for me. This is where I can have the most impact. So let's go.
Wonderful. So I wanted to kind of imagine a situation here, and this is something that's very common for people who are in my position. If you're not quite familiar, I'm a second-year dental student, so I'm sort of in that place where most people start to kind of think about, their future and where they're going to end up practicing and things. Once you get that base of clinical knowledge, like you're talking about, you start thinking about the future in the business. So let's imagine a young dentist who's maybe 6-7 years out, I guess, still relatively young. And let's say they've worked in sort of the corporate world of corporate dentistry for a little bit, and they've built up some sort of capital. So they've been able to pay off the majority of their loans. And now they're kind of ready to go off and start their own practice and begin this process of building a business from the ground up. So how do you sort of enter into that equation, and what are the steps that a young dentist would take in that situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first question would be, do you want to acquire a practice? Do you want to buy a practice? And if you do, you're going to have to deal with real estate. You're going to have to either purchase the facility or the building if it's for sale, or you're going to have to enter into a lease agreement with a third-party landlord or the doctor who owns the real estate. So if you're acquiring a practice, you've got to deal with real estate, either a new lease, getting a lease assigned to you, or buy the real estate. If you want to do a startup, then the questions are, where do you want to be located? Do you want to be an office or retail? Do you want to lease? Do you want to purchase? And so we basically just go through an evaluation process with anyone who's considering it. A lot of times, younger doctors who are associates considering practice ownership, they're looking at both. They're looking at either an acquisition, maybe first, and then a startup second, or they have a strong bent towards, I want to start up. And the only way I would buy a practice if I can't find what I'm looking for. So we can help in either one. And we just start a due diligence process where we ask a lot of questions, we consult with them, and then we create a custom strategy or game plan aimed at helping them maximize in that transaction, whichever one it might be.
Right. And so, of course, this question really depends on a lot of different factors about location and a bunch of different things. But do you have sort of an opinion on acquisition versus startup? I imagine that naturally a startup is going to be a little bit more difficult. But is that may be too broad of a question? Of course, it depends on geographical location, the age of the dentist, the amount of money that's available. But what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, that's a really good question. And let me start by saying this. Most dentists are programmed, or most students or residents are programmed by professors or by practice brokers that doing a startup is not advantageous. They'll come in there and they'll say, nobody starts up, or it's really dangerous, or it's risky. Well, you got to ask the question too, who is telling you that? Is it somebody who doesn't own a practice currently that maybe is a professor or administrator, et cetera? That's possible. But if you're talking to a practice broker, they don't do startups, they do acquisitions. So they get paid to sell practices. So I always tell people, listen, don't take an emphatic of you have to do this or you can't do that unless you know firsthand that's the right option for you. There's a lot of studies on this, and there's pros and cons of both. So let me give you a couple of pros and cons of both. When you buy a practice that's existing, you enter into a cash flow right away, but you also enter into somebody else's space. You enter into somebody else's staff, their patient base as well. So there's pros and cons of that, but the questions are this: do you have to re-equip the space in the near future? Is it the technology that you want? Is that the staff that you're looking for? Is this the brand you're looking for? Are you going to redo the entire brand and the marketing? Is this the location you want to be in long-term, or are you going to relocate this practice or this office in the near future? You can buy a practice and they can spend as much money or more moving it and changing it, and if you just did a startup in the very beginning. And so there's studies, we have a lot of data on this. We can show someone the numbers of buying a practice and entering into a cash flow, but entering into a very large payment as well for that opportunity, and then spending money to reinvest in equipment, technology, marketing. versus someone going and starting up. And we can show you where you can be more profitable in a startup than you could be in an acquisition. Now, I'm a big fan of acquisitions though too. So I'm not saying startups are better. My take is if you can find a really good practice that meets your needs and satisfies your objective, that's great. But make sure you run the numbers compared to a startup, because you might be entering into an acquisition where, yes, there's an immediate cash flow, but in the first 2 or 3 years, you'll actually make less money in that practice than if you did a startup. Yes, it'll be leaner in a startup the first 6 to 9 months, but you can ramp up quickly. It typically costs less to start up than to acquire a practice. And you can find yourself in a place where you can be more profitable and make more money overall the first 2 to 3 years. So both are valid, both are great opportunities. And don't let someone tell you have to start up, you can't buy, or you have to buy, you can't start up. That's just them telling you their personal opinion. It's very rarely factual.
So you mentioned there that starting up is typically less expensive than acquiring it. Why is that? Is there a reason for that?
Well, and it depends on what you're trying to do, but typically you're capped on a startup as far as how much money you can borrow from a lender. Specialists can borrow more money than a general practitioner can, but a lot of times you're capped at $450,000 to $550,000. A lot of practice people are purchasing, they're borrowing more than that. The practice might be that much, but then they're also borrowing for working capital. And again, renovating the space, rebranding it, working capital, marketing. And so typically the typical acquisition, in my opinion, is more expensive than $450,000 to $550,000 for a startup. When you're doing a startup as well, if you're leasing, you're getting a build out allowance from the landlord to build a space. You're getting free rent during the build out. You're getting free rent once you open to help offset startup costs. And you've got other concessions, startup loans. A lot of lenders will discount the payments during the first year, give you a reprieve for making a payment for 4 months or 6 months. Once you start the loan, they'll give you a discounted payment for the rest of the first year or even into the second year, depending on who that lender is. And so they're going to help you ramp up, and you can get profitable fairly quickly in a startup. And overall, your debt might be lower than if you purchased an existing practice. Now, you go buy a practice for $400,000, different story. My assumption is if you're buying a practice for $400,000, there's not a huge cash flow there. And my guess is you probably need to re-equip or upgrade a lot of things that are there too. We just see a lot of doctors that'll go buy a practice for some cash flow, spend a bunch of money renovating, new equipment, new technology, maybe change out some staff, figure out how to work with people that they didn't hire. And all of a sudden they find themselves borrowing twice as much as they would have on a startup, and they're still trying to fix problems and issues. Whereas a startup, it's your staff from day one. It's your brand and message from day one. You pick the finishes, you pick the equipment, you pick how you wanted to equip the operatories, and you get exactly what you want from day one. It takes a little longer to get that money coming in, but if you do it right, you can get very profitable very quickly. And again, over the course of the first 2 or 3 years or 5 years, you can make a very healthy income, and oftentimes even more in a startup than you can in an acquisition. If you're focused on month one, sure, acquisition is going to yield you more profit, but you got to look at it from a much bigger picture than that.
Right. And I think this is great, because all of these questions and considerations are things that, once again, we don't typically tend to think about that in detail, and that's where you come in. And I think it's interesting too, like something I've heard is that in the acquisition process, you are also purchasing a patient pool. You're purchasing access to the patients that the outgoing doctor was treating for however many years. But what tends to happen, and you might think like by nature, okay, I'm starting out with all these patients, this is great. But what tends to happen is that people will find that this doctor has left, they've retired, they've moved on, and I don't want to go to whoever's going to be there now without really even giving it a try. So you end up with a small percentage of your patient pool that you purchased. And so and I don't know if it's a one-to-one thing where from a startup, maybe you're starting from zero theoretically, but even that doesn't necessarily seem all that advantageous when it comes to acquisition and making that argument. So once again, all of these things are kind of tough for us to think about, and that's where you come in. So if you had, once again, back to this young dentist, if you had a young dentist who was looking at this process, do you have agents that are going to then sit down with them and have these discussions and try to figure out where they're at and what they want out of their profession and their career?
Absolutely. We're going to start by asking questions. Where do you live currently? Where do you want to live long term? What type of dentistry are you trying to do? Are you a specialist? If so, who are your referral sources? Are you a specialist who's going to market to the public? Do you want to be in office? Do you want to be in retail? Do you want to lease? Do you want to own? there's a lot of considerations there. And oftentimes the person says, I don't really know, which is great. Our objective or game plan then is, let's go look at all your top options. Let's not look at 20 properties, but let me take your data and your requirements. Let me go to the market, find the top properties, whittle it down to the top 6 or 8, and then I'll show them to you in a 2-hour process. Then we pick the top 3 or 4 properties. We start negotiating on them simultaneously. And then you're not wondering, should I have looked at retail versus office? Should I have looked at owning versus leasing? You've seen the entire market. You're seeing the pros and cons of every property. And when you're going from property to property, and then we start negotiating, you're seeing the offers coming in, because it's done on a non-binding basis where you can negotiate with 3 or 4 people simultaneously. You're not wondering if you're getting a good deal. Like, you're seeing one landlord come in with a certain lease rate and a certain tenant improvement allowance, and then you're comparing that landlord to 2 or 3 other landlords. You're going to know quickly if this is a good deal or an average deal. And that's the benefit of having an expert on your side who's advising you. It takes the guesswork out. I mean, it's like saying, hey, what's going on with my tooth? Well, let the specialist or the dentist look at it, take an x-ray, and they'll tell you exactly what's going on with it. I can say, hey, what do you think's going on with my tooth right here? Well, I could guess, but we can actually get in there and find out for sure. It's no different with real estate. We can get in there and find out, is this the best deal we can get? Because we went 3-4 rounds of negotiations with 3 or 4 landlords. We're going to know unequivocally if it's a good deal or not. And when you get that information as a dentist, you can say, you know what, that's the peace of mind that I'm looking for. No different, again, than a patient. What do I need to do? Well, here's what you need to do. You need a root canal, you need a crown, or you need an implant, or you need whatever, and here's why you need it. When you give them the information and you show them, it's okay, great. Let's make the best decision now and move forward.
Right. Wonderful. So now imagining we're outside of this young dentist situation, and let's say we have a doctor who's been practicing for 35 years, and they're kind of looking, and they've had great amount of success in their current business and in their current location. They're looking at sort of creating a satellite and buying another space or leasing another space. What does that process look like? And how would you advise someone who is looking at expanding from one dental practice in one building into another one in another location?
Similar process. If you have a practice that you're trying to acquire, we want to take a detailed evaluation of the lease and figure out, are we going to assign the lease to you, or are we going to try to negotiate a brand new lease with a third-party landlord or with a dentist that's selling the practice that they own it, or can we buy the real estate? So we're still doing a full real estate evaluation on that specific location. We're trying to figure out, is it a good deal currently? Can we renegotiate it? What's the upside? If there's 2 years left, if we renegotiate it in 2 years, what are we looking at? And so we're doing the due diligence on that location. If it's a new location, it's the same thing as a startup. We go to the market, find the top options that meet the criteria, negotiate with multiple owners, multiple landlords, and we try to figure out what's the best property for that doctor's requirement. And then ultimately they make the choice. They say, this is the one I want to be in, and here's the terms that we've got, and I'm ready to move forward.
Right. And once again, this is so situational. So I know each of these questions can be difficult to answer because it's like, well, every single situation is different and every single doctor is different and all that. But I was wondering if you could just sort of touch briefly, maybe this question would have made more sense earlier on, but touch briefly on leasing versus purchasing a space. I think this is obviously one of the most important decisions that you would have to make in this process. And so maybe just some of your thoughts with your professional experience on these two options.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's one of the most common questions we get. Should I lease or should I purchase? Our response to that is, let's look at both options. I know I keep saying that same thing, but it's let's at least know what's out there. There's some markets where you could say, I want to own, and there's not one property for sale, and there's no land available for you to purchase land and then develop your own building. And so there's some doctors say, I want to own, and there's not an option to, or the only option to buy is a $6 million building and you can't afford that. So some places in the country, some markets, there's no options to own. Other parts of the country, there might be 3 buildings for sale and 4 pieces of dirt or land for sale, and you've got all the options you want. The benefits of owning are several. One, you stop working with landlords. You get out of that confrontational situation where every 5 or 10 years you got to go toe to toe with your landlord, and there's a strategy in a game that has to get played every time. You basically stop that. That's great. When you're owning real estate, every time or every month you cut a check, you're paying down principal. Your net worth increases every single month by $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000 a month as you're paying down principal. Just like with your house, every month you cut that mortgage check, your net worth goes up. Commercial real estate, there's some very substantial tax deductions you can pick up. You get depreciation on the real estate. You can get bonus depreciation if you have a good CPA. And you can find yourself in a place where you're saving tens of thousands of dollars per year in taxes because of all the depreciation, the interest deduction, the operating expense write-off, the tax write-off, et cetera. So there's a lot of deductions that come with commercial real estate ownership as well. So if you can find a property that meets your needs, it's where you want to be long-term and the numbers work. I mean, oftentimes, and we track this in our company, over 75% of the time when there's real estate ownership involved, it's worth more than the practice itself. So you build up a practice over 30 years and the real estate's worth more than the practice 3/4 of the time. So if that's on the table, that's phenomenal. Now, on the leasing side, here's some of the pros. You've got flexibility. You can get into a space, you can be there for 7 or 10 years. And then when you are really killing it and ready to go for that dream practice, or that this is where I'm gonna be for the next 30 years, now you can pull the trigger on that. If you lease, landlords will give you a free build out period. They'll give you free rent once you open. They'll pay for a portion of your build out in the form of a tenant improvement allowance. And so that might be the difference of you borrowing a couple $100,000 less than if you went out there and did something all by yourself. So you're borrowing less money, you're paying less interest, you're very likely might have a higher cash flow depending on the size of the deal. So leasing can be really advantageous on a startup or for a lot of doctors. And then also some doctors just don't want to deal with it. They just, I don't want to deal with the property management, the maintenance, the issues, the mortgage. And so do you want to work with it? Do you want to deal with it? What's your appetite for the project, the transaction? What do the economics look like? But then ultimately, we're coming back to the most foundational question. What is the top option for you? Sometimes the option to purchase is dramatically inferior for the location of the property than leasing. And we got to say this, go for what's going to give you the strongest practice, because real estate is still secondary to the practice.
So a big discussion in dentistry, I think, as of late, if you compare dentistry now to what it was in the past, there were fewer dentists in the past. So there were obviously more opportunities for dentists to get out there and establish an area. Nowadays, if you go to a city, you're going to have a dentist every other door, essentially. So do you have any thoughts on kind of rural areas versus the more populated areas, and which ones, once again, this is situation to situation, but do you have any thoughts on that whole discussion?
I do. I always ask doctors the first question, where do you want to live? Because sometimes they'll say, well, I'm willing to live rural if it's a better practice, but they don't really want to live rural. And so you got to ask the question, listen, would you rather live in the place that you're gonna be the most happy, the most fulfilled, where you want to raise your kids, where you want to raise a family, or do whatever you do? Is that going to be first in your life, or do you want to be in an area where you're always wishing you were somewhere else, but you make more money? So where do you want to live? If you want to live rural or in a smaller community, and that's what you're going for, there's great opportunities in a lot of communities. And I mean, you can get rural and then you can get really, really rural. Depends on what you're looking at. I still think there's a lot of opportunities out there for dentists, even when in a competitive market. People are more aware today than they ever have been before, aesthetically, cosmetically. There's more education out there on what you need to do to take care of yourself than ever before. And so even though it's more competitive, people are also a lot more aware today of what they're supposed to be doing or what's available to them for treatment. You know, can you do this for me? Absolutely. So I think that it's more competitive, but people are also more aware and more willing to spend money on it also.
Right. And that's so true. I mean, we've seen, I think just with the rise of the internet, people are tend to be a little bit more like their baseline education level on dentistry or healthcare is a little bit higher because they have the ability to go to YouTube or go online and look at forums and things of people talking about their experiences with it. So you'll find nowadays that people come into the office with a little bit more knowledge about the different types of treatment that you would have in a dentist's office versus back years ago before the internet, where people basically went to the closest dentist and they just kind of went in and whatever the dentist said they did. So it's an interesting discussion. And once again, I appreciate you answering these questions because I know they're tough to give a broad answer to a question that is so specific and is really dependent on the practitioner and what they want. But Colin, I was wondering if you could kind of address a lot of the viewers of my YouTube channel and this podcast are either pre-dental students or dental students. So I was wondering if you could kind of try to give me an idea what we should be thinking about as students. And this could be just from a general business perspective, like what we should be looking into, things we should be reading and researching, or it could be more specific to real estate. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a handful of thoughts on that. What I would tell you is you need to be as strong clinically as you can possibly be, because that is the business you're in. If you don't do a good job clinically, that'll be the end of your practice quickly, or that will dramatically reduce the referrals. If people aren't happy with the service and the quality of care you provide, then they're not going to refer their friends and family, which is the top way you want to grow your practice. What I tell you outside of that, though, is that you also have to be an astute business person. And what that means is you're not supposed to be the jack of all trades. You don't need to spend the next several years studying commercial real estate and try to become an expert there. You want to hire the most qualified person to represent you in your transaction. No different than this. I mean, when you're a dentist, you're not doing your own tax returns. You're not doing your own tax planning and tax strategies. When you're getting a contract to review as an associate, or if you're buying in, you're not reviewing your own contract. You're finding the best attorney you can possibly find. So the game plan for a savvy dentist is be smart enough and be in tune with business to the level that you can hire the most qualified people possible and build a masterful team around you. If you do that, they're going to protect you. They're going to tell you, here's what you need to pay attention to. Here's what you need to avoid. You don't need to go into a transaction being a commercial real estate expert, but if you bring in an expert, they'll tell you and they'll hold your hand through the entire process. This is what you do. This is what you don't do. And it's the same with marketing. It's the same with a CPA. It's the same with a phenomenal real estate attorney. You surround yourself with the most qualified experts possible, and then they will educate you. And over the course of your career, you will become very savvy in a lot of areas. And that's how you do it. Don't learn it yourself. Let the master or the expert teach you how to do it or what you need to know. And they will make you a lot more successful than if you take the do-it-yourself approach. The do-it-yourself approach is a guaranteed recipe for you falling flat on your face, losing a ton of money. And yes, you'll learn from it, but that's not the best option by any means.
Yeah. And healthcare as a profession is probably much different than most other professions. And I think that's one of the reasons why you are doing what you're doing and sort of specializing in on healthcare. And so it's so important that we have good people to help represent us when it comes to the business side of things, because I know firsthand we do spend a ton of time clinically, and that's just like what we learn. And there's so little discussion about how to actually run a successful business. And that's why people like yourself and your team are helping get us through this process. So is when you go out to hire new agents for CARR, are you looking for healthcare experience, or is it something where it's like we want people who know the real estate business and then we can kind of teach them how it works specifically within healthcare?
So we do have people that have healthcare experience. We do have people that have real estate experience, but the vast majority of our agents that we bring in have been very successful in other industries, and then we train them exclusively in real estate and healthcare. And people will say, well, that must take longer. It actually doesn't. They actually don't have all these bad habits and all these things that they bring to the table. They don't have baggage, and we just train them from the very beginning. This is how you do it. And we know how to do it. We do it very, very well. I mean, we'll represent this year north of probably 5,000 doctors across the country with their real estate. It's all we do. And so no different than a specialist. I mean, you talk to an endodontist, do you think you're better at doing root canals than someone who does a root canal every 4 or 5 months? I would say yes. You got a better equipment, better technology. You've been trained additionally in that area, and that's what you do day in and day out. So for us, it's all we do day in and day out. Our people are trained very specifically, but yeah, we're looking for people that have the right mentality, that have the right skill set, that have been highly successful somewhere else, and then we train them exactly the way they need to do it, and they get results better than people that have been doing real estate for 20 years.
Wonderful. Well, Colin, where can people kind of learn more about your business, what you do, and all the things that CARR is offering to practitioners?
Absolutely. Best way to reach us is our website, and that's carr.us, CARR.us. We've got a couple options for you. In the upper right-hand corner, you can click to find an agent. So if you're in a market across the country and you want someone to help start a discussion or start advising you, you can find that person very quickly. We also have a button for a free lease evaluation. If you're a leasing space right now, or you're looking at buying a practice and there's a lease there, we'll do a free lease evaluation, and we can tell you very quickly, this is a very good deal. Let's do this. It's an average deal, so just understand what's available. Maybe there's an upside when you go to renew it in the future, or hey, this is a really bad deal, and just understand you're going to overpay for a very long time if you buy this practice, or if we don't renegotiate it. So free lease evaluation is a phenomenal tool. And then we've got more educational content than you could read in a year or two. And it's all designed to help healthcare providers be more educated. So if you do like to get more information and you're the type of person that likes getting educated in different areas, we've got articles, blogs, videos, press releases, press mentions, et cetera. And you can see a lot of educational content where we walk you through things you need to understand, things you need to avoid. And you can come out of school or residency, or you can get built up your first couple of years, and you can be way ahead of the curve in that area.
Well, Colin, thank you so much for being here and for talking with me about all of this. Once again, it's something that is a little bit foreign to me, and it's a little bit foreign to a lot of us who are in this position. We're very focused in on learning dentistry, and I think what happens to a lot of people is they get out and they're like, oh my gosh, there's so much more to this whole business that I was not prepared for. So thank you for your time, and also thank you for helping us healthcare professionals out when it comes to navigating the business world. And I think it's safe to say if a landlord sees a young doctor walking in with a car agent, they probably quiver a little bit, and they know that they're not going to be able to pull over the fast ones that they otherwise would be. So thank you for everything that you do.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
All right. Well, once again, we appreciate it. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Teeth Time podcast. I hope this conversation was at least somewhat enjoyable for you. Remember to check out my YouTube channel, that's Stephen P. Ray on YouTube, where you'll find plenty of visual content about the life of a dental student and creator. Also check out my Instagram at stephen.p.ray.dentistry. Long name, I know. I appreciate each and every one of you. This has been Teeth Time, and I'm out.